Um, Welcome everyone to NextGen's Lunar Ethics and Sustainability panel. Thank you everyone for coming, and I'm excited to have an interesting discussion on these really important issues. So my name is Alicia. I'm the EDI lead for the NextGen OC board. I'll be one of the hosts for the event, and I'm joined by Gavin. Can you introduce yourself, Gavin?
Hi everyone. So, yes, my name is Gavin. I'm the events lead on the NextGen organizing committee, and my pronouns are he, him, and I'm really looking forward to this panel today.
Great, awesome. So I'd just like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. So if you don't want your voice to be recorded, then just type in your questions into the chat or the Menti link that we sent earlier to the participants. So I'm just going to read out our code of conduct. So the Next Generation Lunar Scientists and Engineers group expects organizers and participants alike to contribute to a harassment-free environment for all, while attending a NextGen event, workshop, networking function, online forum, chat rooms, social media, or other NextGen related activities. Organizers and participants should not engage in harassment in any form. As a group, we aim to share ideas and freedom of thought and expression, and it is essential that the interactions between members within and others outside of the group take place in an environment that recognizes the inherent worth of every person by being respectful of all. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to get our panelists to introduce themselves. So if you could give us your name, your pronouns, and your areas of expertise. So I think we'll start off with Anu.
Was not expecting to go first, but thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Anu or Anuradha, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm based in London in the United Kingdom, where it is not as early as it is for a lot of you right now. My areas of it, so I work for an organization called Vertic, which is an NGO that focuses on basically using science, technology, policy, law compliance to make sure that countries aren't breaking international agreements or doing bad stuff generally with weapons of mass destruction. And my interests there are broad. Sorry, I'm just putting do not disturb on. That's terrible. My interests are very broad at Vertic, but one of the areas I focus on is space safety and security, and how the erosion between the silos of space safety and security need to be recognized a bit more. And space security more generally when it comes to normative, regulatory, or even treaty-based frameworks, and how that works within an international system and connected economy. I'll stop there and let someone else go.
Shall we go with AJ next?
Hey y'all, I'm AJ. I'm a cis Black male with a beard and a gray shirt and a hat and a gallery wall behind me. I'm based in DC on land that was stolen from the Piscataway and Anacostan people. And I focus on human rights in outer space, but I also do diversity and inclusion in the aerospace industry as a whole. So recruitment and kind of workforce development on all those types of things. And I do that at the Center for Air and Space Law.
Amazing, thank you. Michelle?
Hi everyone, Michelle Hamlin, she, her. I first want to just note that AJ is incredibly modest. He's one of our star students here at the University of Mississippi. So I'm based in Oxford, Mississippi at the Center for Air and Space Law, where I'm the co-director. We're focused a lot on human rights in space and sort of bridging that, being that bridge to help humanity become a spacefaring and multiplanetary species successfully and sustainably and equitably. I am also the president of the National Space Society here in the United States. It's an international organization based here, and I am the president and co-founder of For All Mankind, which is the only organization in the world focused on the protection of heritage in outer space, human heritage, cultural heritage in outer space. I think it's funny when you ask about what our expertise is. I think my expertise is my incredible passion for all things space, and the vision to see human communities in space in a way with a clean slate, taking all of our lessons from Earth and actually producing the society we all want to see in space, and then hoping that rubs off back on Earth for us. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Michelle. That's really important message. Thank you. Natalie?
Hello, my name is Natalie Trevino. I'm based out of London, Ontario, Canada. So the Little London, that the Big London was named after. This is originally Haudenosaunee and Ottawashi land that was taken by the British colonists in North America, or Turtle Island. So my area of expertise is actually anti-colonial and decolonial theory with an emphasis on revolutionary and liberation theory from Latin America as it pertains to international space policy, treaty, law, and basic kind of cultural and rhetorical forms of like space exploration. So my work is focused on the ways in which current paradigms of space exploration globally inherently consist of colonial ambitions, and looking at how we can remove the coloniality from space exploration. So we're not taking a lot of the violent and genocidal tendencies of Western culture into space.
Amazing, thank you for that. Okay, so I think that's all of our panelists. Right, so I think we'll get started on some of our prepared questions. Let me find the document. Here we go. Okay, so the first question is quite a big one. So this is just to any panelist who wants to give their thoughts to us. What do you see as the biggest hurdle that humans face in terms of maintaining a presence on the moon? And what can early career professionals with an interest in lunar exploration help to do to overcome that issue?
I'm happy to get us started. I think so I'm a lawyer, not an engineer or a physicist or scientist. I did raise 2 engineers, so I'm not a complete adult when it comes to that sort of stuff. But I think the biggest hurdle is actually public opinion. I think that we are just facing, people don't understand how important it is to explore space and keep expanding and get knowledge about ourselves and about the space around us. And I think we really need to educate people about how, yes, there are a lot of problems here on Earth, and we're not going to solve all of our problems on Earth from space. That's not the truth. But the truth is that we can use many of the resources from space to help us on Earth. We already do with respect to remote sensing satellites. But we can also learn a lot about ourselves. And, I think people sort of poo-poo William Shatner's reaction to going into orbit, or nearly. But I think if you read Frank White's work about the overview effect, really this knowledge that we are all in this together and that we're just this little blue marble is really important. And I think the other side of that in terms of, yes, we need to create a public appetite for spending money on space activities. We also need to turn around sort of our thinking a little bit, and this is something AJ and I have talked about, and recognize, we look at space, we have this outer space treaty that has all these rules about how we explore space from the perspective of, oh, it's all out there for us, but it's not, right? We have no idea what it's out there for, what we're going to meet or anything. So we really need to sort of change the way we look at space. And I think in terms of, this panel and the important work that Natalie is doing with respect to colonialism and sort of shaking that out of our system. Those are the hindrances, because one of the things that, as important as competition is, and sovereign competition to get to space, we want to remove that sovereignty. A lot of the work I do at From Unkind seeks to remove the sovereign paradigm and move us beyond nations and nation states. Let's get rid of the Treaty of Westphalia and start with something new in space. So now that, yeah, I got the chair, so I'll let Natalie go.
I like to joke that just the destruction of the Treaty of Westphalia is like my life's purpose. So I'm actually going to jump off of that, but also kind of complicate it a little bit more, because as a scholar of anti-colonial theory, also my cat is going to show up just a minute. I can see her planning her jump. It's a matter of, I tend to joke that it took cis white men being shot into space to see what indigenous people have been saying for thousands of years, which is we are all interconnected. This world is our lifeblood. We are connected to it. It doesn't belong to us. And that, you know, we shouldn't have to go into space to treat the Earth with kind of respect and our mutual humans with respect, but it does actually help. We all know that the Earthrise photo was monumental in changing the way in which human beings, and by that I really do mean like the colonial human, understanding their position on the planet, seeing that sort of thing. And we're all very, we tend to be very visual or narrative, and having that ability to say, this is why we're doing it. I think there's a huge disconnect with the general public on going into space. And because what we've had historically has been this competition of, well, we have to beat the Russians. Well, okay, why? Or, you know, we can go and mine the moon for this or that. Okay, why? And it's getting to the root of the question of why that goes a bit beyond, well, it really does go beyond, you know, science, engineering, even a lot of the humanities. It asks questions about what it is to be human in our place in the universe. And those are really complex questions that oftentimes are put to the side when it comes to the excitement about building lunar rovers or what we could possibly be doing on the moon. So I think that we need this narrative shift. But we also need a massively global shift when it comes to why we're even doing this, you know, because it is a legitimate question of saying, you know, why are we spending money on going to the moon when we have all of these things here that need to be taken care of. And we all know, people in the space realm, we know, like, if we shut down NASA tomorrow, all of that money is not going to be redistributed to social services, unfortunately. But we can start to say, hey, there's a lot more going on here than just the right now. And that's something that I think is incredibly important about shifting the ideas around going into space. So I think to go to the moon and be sustainable there, we have to have a fundamental change in the entire conception of what it is to be human and what it is to be in the universe.
Anu has a hand raised, so I'll let Anu go.
No, I just wanted to indicate that if no one else is going next, I'll go next. But I'm just gonna, because this is such a big question and there's so much we want to get through, and I want to make sure that everyone who's here has a chance to engage as well. I'm gonna set 3 sort of cars on a track, and then we'll come back to the cars and see how they're doing later. So the first lens I want to talk about is this lens of, which everyone has touched on already a little bit, of what is considered, you know, who is in the decision-making seat when it comes to these things and who historically has been in the decision-making seat. So as well as my job, I run the UK chapter of an organization called WCAPS, which is Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. And the whole shebang is about, well, all of these years, people have been designing policies and designing regulatory frameworks, but it's been a very small subset of people, and you can't replicate tacit knowledge and experience through education and degrees and whatnot. So we really need to be, not just for the sake of being nice, diversifying the decision-making space in every way, not just in people, but in processes, to ensure that, you know, policy is fit for purpose. So that's the first track that I think we really need to think about is, are we going to replicate the mistakes that we've made? And yes, I will call them mistakes, you know, in other fields of, and, you know, I'm here as the security person, so fine, security, or emerging tech deployment, or science deployment with my physics hat on, because we're so used to doing it one way and it has worked for a small subset of the population and worked in their benefits. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we need to move away from a US centric or US versus Russia centric point of view. As someone based in the UK who works on security issues, it can be really infuriating to go to lots of events and have the most well-meaning people in the world, because they live in the US or because they live in a country that's allied with the US and they always see US, Russia, US, China. to constantly be talking about that. And actually, there are countries out there that are incredibly developed and interested in space exploration, including India, including African countries, Arab countries that have that capacity, but their motivations are different. Their motivations for wanting to have a space program or taking it back, wanting to have a nuclear weapon, for instance, are completely different to what the US, the UK, France, Russia all wanted these things for. The technology and the semiotic meaning and power of those things are something completely different. And so in order to actually, maintain a sustainable and fair presence on the moon, which I don't even think is theoretically possible, given how we operate right now, I think there needs to be a rewiring of what we consider security and who the security is for, and who that presence is for, and who this policy is for. And then the third thing, and we have two lawyers here, so I'm just not going to get into it. But as we know, okay, maybe we don't know, but from a policy perspective and a security and safety perspective, the regulation of space is still a bit, I'll interpret it like that, or I'll interpret it like that. And I'm sure we're all very tired of hearing about the fact that there are more commercial actors operating in space at the moment than imaginable. And so before we start deploying things, and before countries get ahead of themselves, and some would argue they already have, to be like, we're so excited about this new thing we can do. We're so excited, we can 3D print on the moon with all of this new additive manufacturing technology. Before we get to that, we need to understand what the risk of deploying a technology in an underregulated or misunderstood and misregulated environment is. Because what you then end up with is these power divides. You end up with arms races in like the most subtlest terms. I don't like it when people talk about the space race, or they talk about space just being militarized, like out, but we really need to be careful. And the role of science, technology, communication with diplomacy, taking out that element of cherry picking, which is what we call politicians picking bits of scientific information that work in their favor to make decisions. All of those things need to be addressed. And I know that this is a really pessimistic view, because the moon's really pretty and I do want us to go there. But I think before we start, and the use of the word colonization as well is problematic in and of itself, right? It's incredibly Western. And it was literally used to terrorize countries in the East. But that's a whole other thing. And I'm sure Natalie has much to say about it. The point is, these are the three sort of things that I'm interested in having more of a discussion about, just to put on the table alongside these amazing panelists. And I'm going to stop now and let AJ go.
Hey all, it's AJ speaking. I'm glad I went last because my answer was a lot more simplistic than all the really articulate thoughts. And I think like when I first saw the question, just because of where I focus, and it's like human centric, I think humanity is the biggest obstacle, right? Just all of our flaws as human beings, as countries, as states, as individual actors with different priorities, our selfishness, our capitalistic drive, whether that's, through greed or through, having to survive in a capitalist system. I think that we as humanity have a lot of things that we need to work on in order to survive and continue to survive. I think everyone made a small point in some way of like the way that we've done things historically have benefited some people. But there are a lot of people who haven't benefited from that. And so if we do want to have a long-term presence on the moon, in space, on other celestial bodies, we really need to reflect on who we want to be as human beings in the broader context of the cosmos, right? Do we continue to want to be the conquerors and the colonizers, and the people who are just mining for resources to grow our wealth? Or do we want to be really embedded in nature, right? I know it's kind of viewed as indigenous, quote unquote, to view ourselves as part of the larger existence of the universe, but that's what we are, right? Earth is a really, really, really small little pebble in the grand scheme of things, and we act like we are just preordained to go out and conquer everything else. And that's a problem. I think there are a lot of negatives to that. So I think we as a species are our biggest obstacle. We've shown that, when we do get it right, we can be pretty amazing. That's kind of where I am in terms of being hopeful for the future.
Does anyone have anything else to add to this question? No, okay, great. That's super interesting thoughts, everyone. Thank you so much. I think we're going to move on to the next one, Gavin.
Yes, so I think one of our next questions is, and before I do say that, just a reminder to all attendees, if you do have any questions for our panelists about all the discussions we're going to have today, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll be able to get to them near the later section of the panel. So the next question is, we're going to be looking more on accessibility. So what challenges do you think we face in terms of making the moon more accessible to everyone? And should we make it more accessible to everyone? I guess we could maybe go in reverse actually and start with AJ.
Thank you all so much. I was just laughing because like accessibility is the buzzword for my life and everything that I do. I think that one, we need to really acknowledge that we fail at accessibility here on Earth, just point blank, whether it's through a lack of knowledge or intentionally being ableist and hating disabled people. I think our conception of what accessibility means and what access means needs a complete paradigm shift, right? And that goes beyond just disabled folks, but it's also accessibility with income, because space is really inaccessible when you think about income requirements and wealth requirements to get to space. When you think about access to the room and the decision making, like it's another part of accessibility, like who's making decisions about what we're doing in space and what does that room look like. I think it was Anu who maybe talked about this really Western US centric idea of these are the people who are most valued and where the conversation needs to go and needs to be had. So when I think about access, it's not just the structures and the safety precautions and the dangerous nature of the moon and like how Regulus could like just cut your throat if you mess up, right? Because it's so sharp and fine. But it's like, yes, space should be accessible for everyone who wants to go. And I think part of that is acknowledging that not everyone wants to go to space. Not everyone is inspired by space. I know that I do a lot of panels that have a lot of conversation with people who love space and love the stars, but a lot of people don't. And that's okay, right? We should make space as accessible as possible for everyone who wants to go. And we need to acknowledge that not everyone wants to go. And I think that should be our starting framework. And I don't necessarily think that is right now.
So just to jump off what AJ just said, absolutely. Accessibility is never about forcing anything on anyone. We're not saying, I think it was like 3 years ago, someone wrote an article in The Guardian about this push. The Guardian is a UK left-wing newspaper. And they wrote an article about how girls are having STEM shoved down their throats at school and they don't actually want to do it. And I'm sick and tired of, that's not what accessibility work is about. That's not what it is. It's if you want to do it, you should have, a boost to be able to do it. And we should make you able to do it. Now, we could have a very long chat about accessibility. AJ is the person here to talk about that, so I'm not going to go off on my EDI rampage right now, but there is one thing that I think is quite interesting and not talked about enough, and it's about space exploration as a human. And the reason I want to talk about this is because my flatmate best friend is studying to become a space doctor. And one of the things they're frustrated with is the implications of how we do medical testing on Earth, how we treat data, and the ethics surrounding that, and how that impacts the people that can go into space, so who can do the exploration, and how there basically is such a big bias in who we do testing with and who we design things for, that space exploration isn't actually, at the first instance, when it comes to the people, safe for everyone. It just isn't. I mean, forget space, birth control isn't safe for those who use them. So it's thinking of, again, like the systems theory brain of, this is one thing, the human aspect of space travel. We need to be thinking more about investing in making the human body, or understanding the human body, but the average human body, not just the average human body as is considered, not the white, cis, probably male, able-bodied human body, because that's already, you're already putting a roadblock in there. So that's something that I think is quite specific. I believe it was Natalie.
I would not like to overspeak now, but I just want to say that accessibility is so much broader than just the disability category. Like immediately when you were talking, Anu, I was thinking about how it's a big deal that we have the first woman going to the moon, but we don't talk about the first trans person going to the moon, right? Or the first non-binary person, right? I think like accessibility is truly, truly broader than how people conceptualize it. There are so many cross-cutting identities, and like just the idea of first, quote unquote, I know it's really important for marginalized folks, but it's just like really disgusting because there are so many cross-cutting identities, right? Like we've probably already had the first disabled person in space, like quote unquote neurodiverse person in space, quote unquote. We don't know what people were struggling with in terms of their mental health and how that's affecting people in space. Like we need as many people going to space as possible to have the diversity of the human experience in space to understand how that impacts us. And there was a question about that in the Q&A that I would love to get to later, that kind of talks about that. But I'm so sorry, Natalie, I really need to.
I'm going to be really annoying as well, like a 2-second interruption. So I know people like non-binary people that want to go into space and want to do space exploration, but it's a simple fact of the fact that they wear a binder and that's impacted their body, and that would not be considered in how to design safe space flight. Like that's one thing that just hasn't been considered, because even still in medicine it's male, female, and that's like extended to gender. Anyway, Natalie.
Yes to all of that. So when I was reading these questions initially, and I reject the title of being a philosopher because I think I'm a theorist, but I'm going to do a very philosopher thing and go, okay, what do we mean by these words? From the very idea of what is accessibility? What is this very idea? Like space isn't particularly accessible physically. It's not. We can't just go there. But also, the human body is so diverse and so complex, and that sort of like thinking is just not what we have in the space realm right now. Anyone who goes through and reads any of like the medical literature from NASA, everything is very much, and I rally on this a lot. I think that we come from a place, especially like in American hegemonic like notions, where we think that the perfect person to go into space is like a Greek statue of a cis man. I think we really want that idea to go into space, and like no humans are like that. That's literally stone. It's not real. But that's the idea that we end up having. And when you like look into a lot of the literature, what I'm finding in my own research is the resurgence of eugenics in space dialogue constantly. This idea of who can go to space, what can go to space, what's good about going to space, who should be able to go or not be able to go, and what can they do when they're there. And a lot of times these things are played off as thought experiments, but it's really concerning to me because in the work that I do, which is highly anti-colonial, I'm seeing white supremacists grab on to the popular narratives of space exploration because they're like, yeah, we're going to get rid of all of the diverse people. We're going to get rid of all of these things because that's what we need to go into space, and that's the perfect person. And like this isn't just new literature. Like there's a lot of work that's being done right now looking at like who can go into space and who's best about going into space, whether or not that's like about the types of bodies, the types of minds, the types of people, what we want there. But this goes back to even like looking at initial like ideas of Russian cosmism about like only the perfect people will be able to go in to live in space. So we're looking at like a complexity of human flaws, but also that there's this idea where if we just get it right, everyone will be inspired, which is really like not everyone cares about space. I actually, when I was at work, I was saying, hey, I'm spending my lunch break, I'm going to talk about space. And one of my coworkers was like, oh, well, the moon's kind of boring. And I was like, you're boring. But that's true. Like not everyone is incredibly inspired. And I think it's important to know that what we're doing isn't just about once we can convince everybody how cool space is, everyone's going to kind of get on there. We're going to just figure out all of the problems. It's like accessibility in that, yeah, some people don't care. Like my mom doesn't care. My sister doesn't care. But also that other people want to do different things in their lives. And there's also, and this just came up in the chat and I'm going to point on it because I haven't complained about capitalism yet in this, and that tends to be my thing. There is like this incredibly capitalistic centric focus on space right now, like what we can get out of it and what we can do. In fact, I was talking with my partner yesterday about the fact that a lot of these questions that we got are economic questions masquerading as ethical, where the assumption is the necessity of a capitalist system in space to be, sustainable on the moon. Well, how do we sustain capital? How do we sustain the human body for capital in these environments? And like, actually, I don't think capitalism can sustain itself in space simply because of the necessary communal facilitation of community dynamics that will have to be in operation. There was a lot of work done back in the 1980s showing that not the perfect, but one of the better ways of formulating communities in space actually is closer to communism than it is to capitalism. And of course, like this is research being done in the 1980s in the United States through NASA. So of course, like that wasn't popularized. Like those ideas are like, there's no way that under Reagan, people can come out from NASA and go, oh my God, it's actually, the Soviets, they might be onto something. So there's like these economic factors, these political factors, and all of that is part of accessibility. Why is it that rich people get to go into space now? Why are they more deserving of the person who spent their entire life, from the time they were a child up to now, and they're just not rich, or they're not the perfect specimen to go into space, they just don't have it. So why are these rich people much more deserving? What did Jeff Bezos do other than create an empire based on exploitation?
Okay, so I'm going to defend capitalism and Western ideals and everything. First of all, it's important to remember hostility. The West doesn't have a monopoly on hostility and violence. There are a lot of cultures out there that are equally violent and have done equally horrible things. And so I think this, demonizing the West. I'm Chinese. Okay, in Chinese history, a lot of people have been killed. Chairman Mao was responsible for killing a lot of people. He's not from the West. So, it's a human thing. It's not a Western thing. Humanity is flawed, just like AJ said. What you have to remember too is we're a culture that is obsessed by celebrity. And so celebrity is giving us our vision of the perfect body. And so, I say, why are we focused on people like Jennifer Aniston and so forth? Because they're creating ideals that our children cannot meet, right? We are not perfect. We are not that perfection. And so in many ways, that concept of a perfect astronaut is painted for us by other people. And that's really problematic. I would note that the most diverse crews that have been sent to space have been sent by private companies, not by the government. So don't demonize the private companies from giving this ability to be able to take other people into space with them. Yes, it costs a lot of money to go into space today. It costs a lot of money to fly an airplane back in 1904. These are things that we are slowly getting to. So if we didn't have the billionaires, if we didn't have Jeff Bezos, he could have spent his money on anything. Sure, he could have spent his money to cure hunger, poverty. Ray Chambers cured malaria or found the vaccine for malaria. That's how he chose to spend his money. But it's his money. It's not your money. It's not my money. He doesn't have to do that. And yet what he's doing, what Elon Musk is doing is promoting and creating more accessibility to space because they're not with the government. They have already changed accessibility to space by making private individuals be able to go to space. And so when you talk about accessibility and diversity, you have to think about that too. These are not government sponsored people, right? These are people who have a dream and they've decided to implement it and they worked hard. No, they didn't work hard, but Elon Musk always had a dream of space, but he knew there was no money in there. He knew he had to make money first. So that's the sacrifice he made. He didn't sit around and dream about space and then say, oh, I deserve to go to space because I've been working on it for 25 years. So you can't think like that. You've got to self-promote. But I want to end on a unifying note because the fact of the matter is we don't get to space unless everybody on Earth has helped us there. So the first human to stand up on 2 feet, the remnants of their footprints are in like Tanzania, right? We don't get to the moon without that person standing up. and saying, oh, wow, look, I can carry things now. We don't get to the moon without people having the courage to overcome their fear of fire and control it instead of run from it. We don't get to the moon until somebody in the Congo picks up a baboon bone and says, oh, look, if I do hash marks and then I add them, that's going to help me figure out what I need for the future. We don't get to the moon without math. We don't get to the moon without glass makers in Mesopotamia figuring out how to, heat up sand and make the glass that we need for visors and so forth. The endeavor to get to the moon is not a Western endeavor, it's a human endeavor. And we don't get there without astronomers in Chile and astronomers in China. This is a human experience. And the more we talk about dividing, the worse it gets. Remember that we're all in this together. And yes, we need to work on accessibility and we need to work on diversity and we need to make sure that we're not, the United States, Russia, China, are not going to the moon and into space alone. We need to do a much better job at sharing those benefits, at sharing those technologies. But you know what? Our hands are tied because there are bad people and bad countries in the world. And so we can't share our technology with China because they just steal it. So, there are realities we have to look at. And anybody who says, oh, China's not the threat is deluding themselves. China has a very centric vision of itself and its future. And we see that from the way they treated the decisions in the Spratly Islands. They didn't care that the international community has said that what they're doing is wrong. They continue to do it. That is that kind of behavior. And it's not just China, the US does it too, I know. But that kind of behavior is the kind of behavior we need to stop. And the only way we can do that is by getting rid of the sovereign paradigm and actually helping people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and figuring out how to help them and put the right guardrails on them. Don't regulate them, stop them, put guardrails on them so that we can make sure that everybody has access to space.
I think it's an important distinction to understand that I think SpaceX and Blue Origin do wonderful things, but we also have to just acknowledge that the way that Jeff Bezos has built his fortune has been on the suffering of millions of people, right? We have to acknowledge that Elon Musk is a visionary in space, sometimes a vision I'm not very fond of, but he is a visionary. But he also supports coups in South America so that he can get lithium at a cheaper price so he can expand his capitalistic empire. I don't think it's the capitalists per se that are participating in capitalism, but rather the system of capitalism that has developed. I think there are atrocities that have happened all over the world, but when we come to kind of state hegemony and state antagonism towards one another, it's built on the current system of capitalism that we have built as a society. I think we all have to take ownership of it, even us who work against it. Like the reason China is so aggressive is based on it gaining power through capitalist and economic means, right? It wants economic leverage to have the regional hegemony in its region of the world and eventually global hegemony, right? It's based on this kind of, zero-sum idea of resources in the future, right? Of who has power and who doesn't. So I think that we should be really inclusive about who we're including in the project, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there are lots of flaws in the system that we've created, right? We are all part of the flawed system, right? Like I had to outgrow my racism, my ableism, my sexism, my misogyny, because I was brought up in that, right? It took active thought and active, energy on my part to kind of outgrow the things that I grew up in. And if you expand that to the entire world, like we have a really long way to go, right? I think that it is right and fair to criticize Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk for the horrible things that they've done, the people they exploit. But I also think that you have to be fair and say that they are leading the way in terms of what space can be for folks. If it's not them personally, at least their companies. And, that's just the complexity of human existence right now. And it's really hard for us to kind of extrapolate one from the other, which is, frustrating, I guess. And I'll stop rambling, but like an example is like in the US context, Thomas Jefferson, who I think is an absolutely horrible person, who was a slave owning human being who often, committed sexual violence against the people that he enslaved, right? But he did write a very wonderful document that has inspired people the world over about what freedom can be, right? What life can be, like what our experience can be as humanity. And we have to accept that duality of human existence, right? We all do awful things and we're all the bad person in someone's story, right? But we can at least work towards having a better future. And I think that we should really put our energy that way.
Thanks for those responses. It's super interesting to hear the different discussions going on. I think we're going to move on to the next question now. So this is a bit of a different direction. What do you think are the best ways to determine ownership of natural resources on the moon? Can anyone or any entity really own a piece of the moon? And will this eventually extend to everything in space?
I see Dan going off in the chat, and I wish Dan could speak on this because Dan is doing such amazing work. I guess I'll start because I unmuted to talk about that, but the idea of ownership is just really scary for me as an individual, right? I know like in the society that we live in, like the kind of world that we live in, which isn't everyone, I won't say everyone lives that way. It's like, well, you have to have ownership of something to share it, right? Or you have to have ownership or something to monetize it and get value so you can share your value and wealth. But like just the idea of owning something in space is just like, I don't know, it's fundamentally against my core. I know that it's impossible to like not have ownership because that's like not the existence that we as humans have created for ourselves, but like, why does anyone have to own anything, right? Like, why can't we just collectively say that this is something that we are not owners of, but stewards of, right? Like, what's the stewardship responsibility of going to the moon, right? You can't just go to the moon, go to Mars, have all these ideas without acknowledging that you have a responsibility to take care of that piece of our celestial existence, right? That environment, right? Like, there is a huge responsibility, and I think that actually doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about quote unquote space exploration or long-term communities on celestial bodies. Like, what is the environmental responsibility of those actors and of those actions, right? Like, you don't get to own regolith on the moon without having the responsibility of making sure that you do what is the most equitable thing possible for the rest of humanity with that privilege that you have and you've garnered to be in that position, right? And so just like the whole question of ownership, like how do you own it properly? Like you don't, in my opinion. Like that's not what's going to happen though, right? So we have to think of a better way, and I don't have that answer, so I'll stop talking. Maybe someone else has a better answer.
I just want to jump off your point, AJ, and address something from the previous conversation that's linked to a comment that was made about, so this will connect into the ownership idea, but it's about what companies have done to outer space being actively uninspiring. So with due respect to everyone on this call, as someone that comes from a family and who went to a school where this career would not have been possible because it was never in my line of sight, and from a family that didn't go to uni, that I could barely pay my way through it, seeing it's fantastic that these companies, are, at the surface level interested in space exploration and making that accessible. What I'm not interested in is the playfulness and the disregard with which they discuss the competition between billionaires. Like, oh, I got there first. Oh, I heard that he was second. Like, oh, actually, we went further into space than they did. It is really unappetizing. And what it becomes for me is another playground for billionaires, and something that becomes even harder to work on and use as an equitable space. I'm not talking about equality, I'm talking about equity. I'm talking about general access to these spaces. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about is this notion of ownership in general. So one of my first ever lectures on security and STEM, so I come from a physics and science policy background, was talking about how back in the day when the first weapons were developed, the most advanced weapons were allowed to be used and owned by people that were considered proper gentlemen, well carried, people that looked a certain way and spoke a certain way, and everyone else had to use weapons that were basically designed for brutes. And those lines were put in the sand, not by these individuals who went in and said, well, we're brutes. It was put into the sand by the people in power. And that has perpetuated through our history and through our time into current politics. A very loose metaphor, but it still has. And so this idea of ownership, well, you can say, oh, well, we're going from square one. No one owns anything on the moon at the moment. But unfortunately, and not to use a term that's thrown around a lot, we do live in a society, and we live in a society that already has pre-designed structures and power structures which will be played out. And you can see that, and I'm not going to talk about Artemis and everything, because that's a whole other discussion to have, but attempts by certain countries to legitimize owning knowledge, owning space and owning parts of the moon and only letting people who are on board with their interpretation of what's acceptable to join in with that, and that being the accepted norm because of who they are and the power they hold. You know, I don't think that any country is absolved of bad, but I don't think any country is inherently good or bad. I think that it's the government, it's the people, and it's what you do with your power that makes that difference. And I think that it's really, really important to acknowledge that, you know, when we move into this idea of ownership, and, you know, AJ did a great job of describing why ownership as a term sucks. But, you know, I think that as we move into the operability and like sort of usability and the capacity of gaining knowledge and learning skills and everything, that is not going to be equitable, because it's not designed to be equitable. And we'd be fooling ourselves if we sat here and we said that that was an equitable thing to do. So equity really, you know, if we're going to operate in this capitalist society as we do, which is fine, you know, whatever, we need to, if we actually want it to work, admit to ourselves that that design is not equitable and it will never be equitable. And you need to own that instead of going in and pretending that it's all hunky-dory. So that's my sort of 2 cents on this. I'm aware that we need to move along, so I'm going to pass it on.
I'm going to jump in there because I'm going to do the philosophy thing again. I apologize. So looking at historical colonization, one of the things that we're still reeling from dealing with as a planet is the what the decolonial theorist De Souza Santos calls epistemicide. So the ways in which Western colonization and Western colonial forces went in and actively destroyed other ways of thinking about the world, knowing the world, and engaging with the world. So that meant that any type of like thinking, theory, epistemological or ontological understanding of their universe, their cosmic order, was systematically destroyed so that there was no other way of thinking. One of the reasons that we end up having like a very hegemonic notion about what it is to go into space and how it is that we think about science and how it is that we think about ownership is because literally those other ways of being and thinking were destroyed. And we know that that is still something that Indigenous people are still trying to come back from, and not just protect their knowledge, but to regain their knowledge and to have it celebrated. All of these things can come from the destruction of language, the destruction of text, the destruction of oral thinking, oral ways of knowledge production. And so that is something that we're actively still dealing with. And that is why Western hegemony is a massive component in space exploration. It isn't because there weren't alternatives or aren't alternatives. It's just that we made it in such a way, and by I mean the West, made it in such a way where it was really impossible to think otherwise. And that's something that still needs to be contended with in space, because when we're talking about ownership, why? You know, we're only talking about ownership because we live under a colonial capitalist society. Otherwise, that wouldn't be even a question. You know, it's kind of like, who owns the moon? Why are we asking this question? We're asking it because we live within a paradigm in which ownership is essential for the production and reproduction of the economy, of the state, and all sorts of other ways of being. And so I think at the end of the day, we have to ask the questions of how it is that we're coming into these ideas, and what's been lost, you know, to add on to, you know, the fact that, you know, these billionaires are doing things and I would consider them uninspired. You know, if this were what I was being raised in, you know, when I was a kid on the farm, I don't know if I would have been as interested in space. They're trying to actively be part of this community by seeing such a, you know, I don't even know what to call it, joke of space. And so really it's, yes, we do live under these conditions. We need to be changing these conditions, not just for the future in space, but for the present, right? All of it, we still live under these conditions. You know, the same day that Wally Funk was celebrated for going to space because she's always wanted to do that, a cis woman in an Amazon facility lost her child because she wasn't allowed to sit down, right? What, you know, and that's when we're talking like, this isn't about equality, this is about equity. And that goes for everything related to space in the universe. And we can't just disassociate those things. It's easy to do in the academy, right? You have sociology, you have political science, you have this and that, but that's not how the world works. So it's all interconnected. And so if there's a pull or tug on one end of these, web, then we're all affected by it.
So the concept of property and ownership are really fraught. And so I would really like to, it's like global commons. I'd just like to get rid of all those words and start over with our nomenclature, ownership. I own my laptop. I worked really hard to own that laptop. My family did not come from great means either. And I worked really hard to own the stuff that I own. So what does that mean? So I'm not suggesting that we need to own property in space, but it is in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that people have the right to own property. You have a right to own stuff. Slaves did not have the right to own anything. So, think about these dichotomies and what does it mean, ownership? So I don't have the answer to, nobody owns the moon. That's a fact. There's no way. But I think, okay, perhaps people can own asteroids. I don't have a problem with that. Those are an infinite resource as far as we know. Maybe we won't know. Maybe it'll be different. The moon is something special. The moon means a lot of things to a lot of different people. The moon has been with humanity forever, for our entire existence. And so the moon needs to be treated differently. We have to recognize the moon as something special and think about how, I don't know, maybe people shouldn't be able to mine the moon. I don't know the answer to that. But the fact is, it's our closest neighbor. We can do a lot of tests on the moon that will help us get farther beyond. And we might not be able to get farther beyond without doing those tests on the moon. I think that the concept of ownership has to start, or whatever we want to call it, it has to start with kinship, not exclusion, right? Not competition. So let's start with our heritage on the moon. Let's recognize, you talk about heritage being erased. A lot of people don't know that the Soviet Union got to the moon first with Luna 2 and Luna 9, right? That's been erased from history in many ways. And For All Mankind wants to bring that history back. And so let's start and think about protecting stuff on the moon, protecting natural sites and cultural heritage sites, and start from there and then think about working around those and what people can do. And it won't be ownership. Yeah, start with a community. It won't be ownership, it'll just be an understanding. And so, let's sort of step back from own property and think of something new.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a really good point, and it kind of shows, at least for the subjects of this call, kind of our limitations of how we were brought up, right, in the environments we were brought up, and the words that we can use to kind of describe these things. Like I go back to responsibility. I think about things like community libraries, which are slowly evaporating here in the U.S. Like no one really owns the library, right? You say the government, right? But the library is for people, right? That people have a responsibility of a collective community, as Dan says, to bring knowledge, right? I think Professor Hanlon talked about the laptop, like we were all on our own devices, but like a really good library would have shared laptops or computers, right? Where people can have, that communal responsibility of making sure that this device is always working and available for people. You don't get to use it all the time. You kind of rotate and share. And I think we just really struggle because of human history, and the ways we're taught and brought up to think about things, right? And it's really difficult, right? Like even us on this call, the vast majority of us don't prefer the word colonization, but when people talk about exploring Mars and the moon, what is the first word they talk about? Like colonizing space, right? And like we know that those people don't mean that with ill intentions, right? But that is the language that they have. That is the idea loop that they are in. And it's really hard to break through that. And that's just really unfortunate.
I kind of want to just end my comments very quickly, just bookend on them, to bring it back to sort of politics, policy, and structures within politics and policy. So this concept of trust, distrust and mistrust has contributed heavily to the idea of ownership, and heavily to the idea that we must have some level of ownership because there has to be some level of accountability and agency. In a global environment where there is mistrust and distrust, and there is reason for that, there is a need for accountability, and there is a need for agency. Agency being, the ability to do things or, be liable for things. And actually, I'd love at some point later on to hear the lawyers talk a bit about the liability convention, and how that might tie in with all of this. But I think until we move away from this, and it's dug right into us, dug deep, right? As Professor Hanlon said, we own our laptops, and I would freak out if anyone tried to steal my laptop, right? So unless we move away from this idea of mistrust and distrust, moving away from a model of ownership, or whatever you call it, is going to be hard unless we reshape what that agency and blame network looks like. The other thing to remember is that the moon means a lot of different things to people in culture as well. To my religion, to Hinduism, I'm not hugely religious, our calendar, and I'm sure, other cultures as well, absolutely, work on a lunar cycle. And so the treatment of the moon actually hugely matters, it matters massively. And as it does to a lot of indigenous communities. And I think that by sort of poo-pooing their concerns, you're doing the thing that everyone, like, why is it okay for us to think that it's okay to have military bases on the moon and that's completely chill and normal, but it's not okay for indigenous, ethnic minority or other communities to be upset that you're using the moon for something bad, that when they use that as a marker for their religion, for their respect and culture? Like, we know why that this exists, but you've got to challenge that thought as well.
So thank you so much, guys, for all those kinds of discussions. It's actually really interesting learning all about this when it comes to accessibility and resources. So we're actually going to move to some of the Q&As that we have that have come in, starting with one here. Humans struggle immensely with distance. Ask anyone in a long distance relationship. How do we address the psychological challenges associated with being apart from Earth?
I would love to take this. So that's not all humans, and people work differently, right? This is also about accessibility. I am a huge proponent of sending neurodivergent folks into space, sending people with histories of mental health illnesses and mental health disabilities into space, because we need to know how it works, right? When you talk about long-term missions, like you talk about going to Mars, you need people who are fully capable of being alone. Like maybe introverts are better for going to Mars than extroverts who maybe struggle around the same 10 people and they don't get the attention that they need, right? Like, I don't feel like these kinds of conversations are happening enough, but I do think that, especially given, the past 18 months to 2 years, right? We have seen that some people have thrived being at home and not having to go out into the world and expend energy pretending to be happy around other people, right? We have seen some people struggle doing that, right? Who hate being inside, hate being alone, and hate not being able to meet new people and go to the bar and all those different things, right? There is such a diversity of thought and experience and the human condition that I think we have this really narrow view of like who can be successful in space, right? There are different types of things you're doing in space, right? There are different types of jobs. Like some people are wonderful teachers, right? Some people are wonderful mathematicians. Sometimes you have a wonderful mathematician who can teach, right? But like sometimes there are just different skill sets, right? And that includes like people's predisposition to being around other people. Like I loved, and this sounds really hard, but I love the change in my life that allowed me to be at home more, right? That helped me thrive. I got to do so many different things and so many more things. I got to be way more selective about the people I interacted with and the projects that I got to work on. And so the past 2 years for me have been like really, really good. And that sounds really horrible given like the tremendous loss of life. And I'm not trying to downplay that, but I'm just trying to show that like different people are suited for different situations and that we should be accepting of that. And that goes back to accessibility and who we're kind of thinking about who makes a good person to travel in space, whether that's short-term, long-term, or what have you.
Actually going to jump in on that because you make a really good point. I think we've spent, and by we, I mean, I say we as though I'm part of NASA. I am not. But one of the things that I've learned in the course of my research is because we have hegemonic ideas of what we think are like successful humans, we end up, and there's a fantastic book about the history of the astronaut, talking about the conception of the astronaut and relating it to the cowboy. And of course, that all goes back to frontierism and, colonialism and all of that, and how like those conditions of the cowboy maybe being successful out in, the Old West is not what will be successful in space, because like you, AJ, the pandemic was great for me. That's like so terrible to say, but the fact that I was able to reach out and do a lot more of my space work because I didn't have to pay to go to conferences. I didn't have to, fly across the world, being an incredibly impoverished immigrant in a country that is not my own. I wasn't able to do any of those things before. And all of a sudden, everybody had to move online, and I could stay in my pajama pants and do the exact same work that I'd been wanting to do. And it was great. And I think like that is something you need. The weird introvert who's going to be like, I'm happy watching anime for 12 hours on the shuttle to Mars. And I realized that just gave a lot of STEM people so much hope, because they're like, wow, yes, you can watch Full Metal Alchemist on your way to Mars, and it's actually going to be good for like humans. And so trying to lighten up the conversation, but to really be thinking about how it is that we want to be in space, we have to kind of be there. I do think that there's going to be a trial and error kind of routine that we're going to have to go through. I think we have to do that no matter what, whether or not you're, moving in with your partner for the first time, or going to a new school, or walking down the sidewalk. Like all those things are going to be trial and error. And one of the things we do have to kind of be open to is this idea of taking away like the rigid ways of which we think about what would be work or what would work, and kind of accept that we might have to go with the flow and we might mess up. It's so totally okay. And I think that's something that's really promising and really hopeful about space, is the fact that, I'm going to do a terrible pun here. If we're in space and we mess up, it's not the end of the world, mostly because you're not on the world, right? So that I think is something that we can really look forward to.
It could be the end of a world, though. I also just wanted to say, again, it goes back to like who wants to go, right? The first mission to Mars, or it will likely be a one-way trip, right? Not many people are willing to do that, and we have to acknowledge that. Like I, for one, would be totally cool just being shipped off into space and never coming back, right? Like my partner is not that way, and obviously we would have to have a discussion if I were selected to do that, right? But like some people are down to just get shipped off of planet Earth and just go, right? And some people are like, I love my family, I love every single person I've ever met here on this rock, and I want to stay here, right? And that's okay. Both are okay.
So I just want to, because I just saw Dan's comment, because he spent 8 years on a fast tech sub, and my son is on a fast tech sub now. We do have, a lot of people who are very experienced working in very isolated areas where they can't do any, they don't even have windows. I mean, presumably most spacecraft will have windows. Submarines don't have windows. So, there are a segment of humanity who has dealt with this. And I think in many ways, space is going to be a lot kinder because of the lower gravity and so forth. But it's also something we think about with space tourism, because, I joke about spending $250,000 to go up on Blue Origin and then having somebody throw up on me. That would really mess up my experience, right? And I would want my money back. And so, but, who am I to say, make sure you don't get motion sick? These are really, it's what's really fun about this conversation is that we get to start talking about these kinds of things, because we are on the cusp of really starting to send a lot more people. And it's like what Natalie said, we won't ruin this world, and we can try and keep trying and keep trying. And what do they always say about space? Whatever, you don't succeed unless you fail. And so I think that, I just think I feel privileged because I probably am twice as old as any of you all to be in this conversation talking about, oh, wow, what kind of people are we going to be able to send to space, and how much fun is it going to be to see how different people react, and how much we're going to learn about ourselves and about humanity as more and more people get there.
That's great. Thanks. I think we're going to have to move on to the next question in terms of time. And that was a great note to end on for that question. Thank you, Professor Hanlon. So another audience question we have, this is more kind of in keeping with what a lot of people in NextGen are working on in terms of space agencies right now. So how do we get NASA and other space agencies to adopt certain anti-colonist standards in lunar exploration? Do you think the Artemis Accords is a good framework for the peaceful use of outer space? So I'm sure this will be an interesting discussion.
I would love for Professor Hanlon to go first and defend the Artemis Accords.
Absolutely. The Artemis Accords aren't perfect. Okay, first of all, how do we get NASA to sort of think about their remit? You know, we are working on that through Congress. The NASA's mission and directive comes from Congress. So we need to work with our Congress people in the United States to figure out what it is. You know, one thing we're doing is trying to make their mission focused again on building communities in space, not colonies or military bases, right? We want to build communities in space. The Artemis Accords, okay, I just have to say it, Section 9, first time we ever have had a multilateral agreement which recognizes that we have human heritage in outer space, okay? First time ever. So I love the Artemis Accords because of Section 9. I also love the Artemis Accords because I don't see them as a you know, how you start a duel. It's not a glove thrown down. It's, look, we need to nudge the conversation. In 2015, President Obama signed the Asteroid Act, which said, you know, if you're in the United States interprets Article 2 to say, if you actually extract the resources, you can own the resources. And that took the international community 6 years. And now the international community is realizing, okay, again, let's not talk about ownership. Let's use a different word because I want to go back into that conversation. But we now have a working group at the UN that's talking about space resource utilization. Because if we want successful communities in space, we will need to utilize the resources in situ, right? And so just being able to use those resources means we have to figure out a way to do that transparently and successfully and equitably. And so to me, the Artemis Accords, when you read them, all but 3 sections reaffirm the Outer Space Treaty. That's all they do. Peaceful purposes, return and rescue, registration. They add the part about orbital debris. They want to bring debris mitigation guidelines from a principle and guideline resolution into something more substantial. Okay, what did they do? They added the heritage, and then they added the concept of safety zones. Again, not that, you know, they're not ownership. It's just we need to start thinking about how we are all going to go to the moon together. And so this is a first step. I understand that, you know, then you have the reaction by China and Russia to create their own little partnership. But what's interesting about the Russia-China partnership is they don't have principles and guidelines. They don't have a framework. They never said the American framework is wrong, the Artemis framework is wrong. They just said, we're going to build our own base or community, whatever you want to call it. They actually call it a base. And so is the US reaching out a hand? Yes. Is the US trying to create norms and custom? Absolutely. Yes. I mean, you can't hide that. But now it's time for the rest of the community, international community, to step up to the plate and say, no, this is wrong. Say it out loud and do it. But nobody said that. So, you know, this is another gentleman, Meme Onwudiwe, talks about how the problem that developing nations aren't heard is that Russia and China essentially believe also in that US interpretation of Article 2. So you're not going to get developed spacefaring nations arguing against that interpretation of Article 2, and we're not getting developing nations to the table to make the argument, or their argument's not being heard. So that's what needs to happen. Artemis is sort of here we are, tell us where we're wrong, and nobody's told them where they're wrong yet. So I encourage developing nations to step in and fill that void.
If I can go next, if that's all right. So very much when Artemis came up, I just messaged the panelists and I said, tag not it, because I didn't want to be the first person to talk about it. So let's do this 2 ways, right? So first, let's talk about the general question about regulation and how to make sure that it's not colonial. So generally speaking, when it comes to the strategic stability, security, safety side of things and military side of things, of which, often when it comes to space exploration, even if it's for knowledge and research, it ties into these things. These dialogues historically have taken place in Geneva. In fact, like this week, yesterday, I think, was the first committee discussion on all of the outer space regulations and the votes on them. And yes, there have been attempts by countries. So the UK over the past 2 years have tabled the resolution on responsible behaviours in outer space, making that on the surface, at least saying we're interested in learning from other countries and capacity building and awareness raising. But I think that at the core of it, not to be this person, but we have to challenge the assumption that certain countries have that when there is a problem, they're the ones to solve it because they know the answer. Because yes, you definitely have the power to solve it 100%. Do you know how to solve it for everyone? No, because you don't know the national politics of that country. You don't know what drives the population of that country. You don't know the status of the education. Basically, you don't have the context of that country. And so often they'll swoop in to do capacity building exercises. They won't be region specific. And then suddenly it feels like one country telling everyone else what to do. On Artemis particularly, I think from a neutral standpoint of someone that works in policy, I think great in terms of, so there's this theory called punctuated equilibrium theory, where if you have a domain in which there's policy and everything has been at a standstill for a while, so negotiating a treaty or any kind of legal framework in outer space is a nightmare, as anyone on this call will tell you. And something needs to happen to break that equilibrium so that there can be movement, right? Because if you have uneven levels of water suddenly, or one hot plate and one cold plate, they'll sooner or later come to terms with each other. And so this equilibrium has been punctuated by the Artemis Accords. Yes, there's been, positive and negative critiques of them. Positive being what Professor Hanlon has so well put out there, it is something. It's something, right? It's saying we want to do this right. The negative critiques are, well, why is it based on the US's interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty? Why is it that if it's my way or the highway kind of thing? And why is it that we're trying to protect knowledge again? Why is it that we're doing that? Is there a plan for sustainability built in to the mechanism within the Accords and how that research is carried out? And so I think, again, like this goes back to the first point I made, which is we need to stop trying to jump ahead of the train that we're on and be like, we're here, we've done it. We need to make sure that we not take our time, but make incremental changes that ensure that we're catch safing ourselves at every step and not trying to do too much too soon just for the sake of it, because then you end up with damaging precedent in place of everything that's happening. So those are the two general points I wanted to make from like a sort of distant standpoint. I'll stop talking now.
Yeah, I'm a bit more pessimistic. I think the Artemis Accords are a great example of modern realpolitik and shaping policy in a very deft way. I think the Artemis Accords can be a really positive thing. I'm just weary of US dictating policy. And I'm also really weary of safety zones. I feel like a lot of people are kind of comfortable with the idea of that, and just to me, and I guess it's how it was brought up, the history I've read of how things just generally work when people in power get to dictate things. Safety zones are going to turn into territory, right? Where they say like, we only have safety zones, so you notify us and we can be safe. But for me, that's just a very, very small step from saying it's not safe for you to come into my safety zone. So if you come into my safety zone, I will defend myself in whichever way I see fit, right? And maybe that won't happen. But for me, I think it's really just really dangerous. And to the point about NASA, Dan said the New Zealand Accords, but I think it's really difficult. It goes back to who we want to be as a society. I know I'd like talk about this a lot, and the work that I do, but like these aren't easy things to change, right? These are things that you have to actively care about and want to change. And unfortunately, in US society, we have a cultural divide for those who aren't in the US, where like when people are pushing for more equity, that's seen as like quote unquote wokeness or reverse racism or, you know, any other type of, you know, kind of political buzzword. And so like we can't get things done, right? We can't push towards equity because we can't even agree that we need equity, right? Like we can't even agree that things need to be rectified or changed. And if you can't even get to consensus on that, like it's really hard to make the changes, let alone decide what the best way to do those changes is. And so I don't see a future, at least a near-term future, where NASA actively and explicitly incorporates decolonialist principles in the work that they do. They may do things that are really beneficial, very environmental, very rooted in diversity, quote unquote, in terms of who they're sending up and kind of the projects they're working on. But I don't think you'll get that explicit language anytime soon, unfortunately. I'm happy to hear someone disagree with that if they think that's different, but that's just me.
I'm gonna jump in here. I'm not gonna talk about the Artemis Accords at all because I feel like I just won't. But I do want to talk about the idea of NASA taking on decolonial principles. One of the things that I think we need to definitely move away from, and I would say that, you know, this is partially my fault, of thinking that we can have decolonization in a non physical sense. So to go back to the fact that decolonization is not a metaphor. We want to decolonize NASA. That means like returning indigenous land. And that is not considered space, right? That's beyond the space realm, but that is what it is. It is, you want to decolonize certain aspects of the space world. Well, first off, you destroy the idea of the 30 millimeter telescope. You return indigenous sovereignty, or you accept indigenous sovereignty of the Hawaiian Islands, and you remove the need for or the desire to plant space technologies there without the express consent of the native population. And so you can't really just kind of bring in decolonial or principles without kind of thinking about the ramifications of why it is that you're doing it. You know, there's this idea of equity, and we can kind of, you know, bring that in. But the fact is that there's a lot going on that would actually have to be non-space related to really think through like decolonial work. So I think that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind. And it definitely goes back to like the idea of what kind of people do we want to be? What is humanity? How do we want to act? What is our community? And therefore, you know, it's, you have to be creating here to eventually create in space. And I think that's one of the things that we definitely need to kind of move away from, is space work is always related directly to space, when space work is Earth work, because Earth is actually in space too. I think we tend to forget that all work done on Earth is space work.
I also think a really important thing, and I'm sorry to jump back in, is that decolonialization will never be truly restorative, right? Like that kind of restitution is just never going to happen, right? We can think about a lot of equity movements and social movements that look to kind of provide restitution and restoration for historical harms or even, you know, recent harms. But, you know, we are living in a world where the effects and harms of colonization will never be able to be fixed, right? That like it, at this point, it's not even harm reduction. It's just like what level of apology is barely adequate. And so I think when we talk about incorporating those principles, like Natalie talked about, the restitution of land and returning 11, like we have to be honest, like those things like that are just really not going to happen, or at least like not in our lifetime in a way that's suitable and just, right? And so we have to think, you know, what else can we do, right? That is not enough, but is also not just tokenization, right? Like it's not using indigenous folks' name to name our aircrafts, right? In our military industrialization, which is you know, wild, but like including people at the table, like taking folks off the ITAR list, right? Like, which is something that I know Dan worked on, and that's important. But like decolonialization, there's no point where that work is done, because that work can never be done. Like we can never get to a point as a society where we can just fix all the wrongs that we've gotten to, right? We can come to a place where we think like this is good enough, but then that's like, that'll never be good enough. And so I think that's like a really hard question.
Well, thank you everyone for those incredible discussions. And unfortunately, due to time, we don't have any more space for questions, but I just like to quickly say thank you to all of our amazing panelists for the discussions on lunar exploration, ethics, accessibility, and diversity. Since I was wondering if we could maybe go to the closing remarks before we end. I think we could start with Anu, if you want to take it away.
Caught me off guard again. So firstly, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to this. I realize I come from a very different perspective on a lot of the issues that were discussed today, and I hope some of what I said was useful. And also a huge thank you to the panelists who are here. You're all amazing, and I know I have heard of your work before this, promise. And I'm just honored to be able to speak beside you. One thing I would say to take away from this is that don't think of the end of this webinar as a conclusion. This is a discussion that can go on for ages and ages and then come to an end, and then we'll have to make it better again, because the world is evolving, we're evolving, and our needs are evolving. In terms of the next gen people that are watching this, we need people working in space that aren't even working in space. Just to kind of touch on what Natalie said, we need lawyers, we need artists, we need linguists, we need policy people and security people and scientists, we need philosophers, we need researchers, we need all kinds of people to make sure that, look, the train has left the station, space is going to be explored, it already is, right? It's already started. So whatever role you think you can play in making sure that that is equitable and fair and beneficial to everyone on Earth, I can guarantee you that it will have a space within this dialogue. I'm going to put my email address in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me if you need any like career resources or anything like that. I have a lot of experience in doing outreach and connecting people. So feel free to reach out to me on there, and good luck. And you know, I wish this could have gone on for longer. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll have AJ next.
Oh, yeah. Thank y'all so much for having these. Like, this is like, I guess, one of the best parts of what I get to do. I would say that I sounded really pessimistic there, but I'm really optimistic about the opportunities in space. And I think don't discredit having these conversations. A lot of my growth in the space sector has come from just listening to other people. Like Natalie kind of really transformed the way I think about decolonization in space, because I never thought about that before I heard Natalie's talk and read some of her work. And so like just having the conversation is a starting point. It's not enough, but the more people we have discussing these things, the better opportunity we have to shape the conversation around space, right? The more people you can tell is like, space is more than SpaceX, space is more than Blue Origin, right? Space is more than NASA, right? Space is like the small entrepreneur in Nigeria who's building drone tech, right? Like there are so many people who are involved in this who can benefit from it, who can, you know, experience the beauty of space. Whether or not they want to, you know, take hold of that is different, but like having the conversations is really important, and having really forthright and honest conversations, right? Like I disagree with lots of people in space, you know, and I'm still able to have the conversations. I'm able to learn and grow, right? Like I'll be honest, before like Professor Hanlon kind of went through the Artemis Accords, this is, you know, a couple months ago or whenever, like I was vehemently against them, right? Like that is just how I was, and I'm at least more accepting of them now, right? Like you have to have the conversations to expand your thoughts, and I think that's really important. And just thank y'all for having me, and I put my LinkedIn in there, and you can find me on all the other things there.
Thanks.
We could go to Natalie next.
Yeah, to kind of go off of that, I think one of the things that we tend to think is that if we're having debates or things that sound pessimistic, that they're non-productive. And really what we need, and this kind of goes back to my educator hat, is we need productive struggle. We need to have these conversations. We need to have that moment of like, oh man, we've messed everything up. How do we come from there? And that's where it becomes fun. Because once you go, okay, if we want to move away from the colonial logic and the colonial language, what do we use? And everyone's, oh, shoot, we don't have that language yet, which becomes creative then. We can go, oh my gosh, we have this entire thing that we can now think through and create as a community and say, this is what we want to do. And this is how we could, you know, it's going to be imperfect, but it's something that we can do. And so I also want to say for a lot of people who go through STEM who are really excited about the science and the technology of space, like that's fantastic. But also know that you're not working in a completely objective paradigm. There's the social, there's the political, and there's the cultural. And those things inform everything about what it is that you do and study. And I think that being hyper aware of that and to be like really test your limits as critical thinkers is what you need to be doing. Because as someone who's educated young engineers where they can't sell the difference between, American hegemony and objectivity, that's a huge problem in the future. It's a huge problem right now, but it's definitely a huge problem in the future in space as well. So be hypercritical because it's not bad. It's actually what needs to be done to, pull apart the very tangled strings of world history, and then putting those back together and braiding them perhaps in the future is something that we get to do after the work.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm glad you mentioned that about not working in like a bubble and being aware of all of these things as scientists and engineers in the industry. Professor Hanlon.
So I feel like I just have to start saying, also be critical of the Chinese hegemony, just putting it out there. I just want to say, AJ said it, but this is really the funnest part of what I do. And I feel very privileged to be able to teach space law and to be able to talk to people like you. I challenge all of you to keep discussing these things and keep talking about them and keep challenging them. I'm 55, 56, I don't know, I'm up there. And so, I grew up in a very different world than you did. And I'm thrilled to be able to be talking about this kind of stuff, but just sort of turning back to space and thinking about humanity. At For All Mankind, we've created a heritage segmentation chart. And so if you go on our website, it's not on the website yet, but we've started with the footprints in Laetoli, Tanzania, and we've created and put in images of all the things we needed to do in order to put a human on the moon. And you can see then that all of those things span the globe. They span cultures, they cover cultures that no longer exist, they cover cultures that have been destroyed by other cultures. And so it really shows that we can't do this successfully unless we all do it together. And so, as much as we talk about all of the things and, is Artemis good, is Artemis bad? Let's keep talking about it because we will only succeed if we go out as humans, and we will never succeed if we continue with this sovereign paradigm and go out as nations. Thank you. And thank you for having me. This was an incredible panel. I was furious and thrilled and happy and furious again. So it's great. Those are the best kind of panels to have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hanlon, and thank you to all of our panelists. We've had incredible discussions and issues, and I think we've all learned a lot. And thank you also to everyone in the audience who's participated and who's asked us questions. If you still have a question that you want to be answered, please email it to NextGen and we can pass it on to the panelists if they're okay with that. And hopefully we can continue to have these discussions and events like this in the future. So thank you all for coming and have a good weekend. Thanks.
Thank you all so much.